Good morning. Before I read this morning's passage from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, I hope you'll just indulge me in a brief moment of nostalgia. I wonder how many of you have ever watched the popular mid-noughties daytime TV show called Cash in the Attic. For me, it was a jewel in the crown of the BBC's daytime TV programming, which was a world I only ever got to enter whether it was on a bank holiday or an inset day or when I was off sick from school. If you ever watched it, the premise was that a family would welcome a typically slick-looking antiques dealer into their home who would explore through their suspiciously large collection of potentially valuable knickknacks, memorabilia and antiques, and then they would take the choice items to auction to see if the family had been unknowingly living amongst a lost masterpiece. And then they would see if they could then reclaim the value. As with all auction-based daytime TV, the tension was palpable as the antiques went to auction, and the contestants sat nervously to see whether Great Aunt Mildred's earrings would pay for a family holiday or whether they would only be able to afford a Tesco meal deal. I'm sure you can imagine. It wasn't featured on the show, but perhaps the most extreme example of unearthing unexpected treasure was in 1989, when a man from Philadelphia brought a $4 picture frame from a flea market. When he opened up the frame to remove the picture which he didn't like, he opened up the frame, he discovered folded inside was one of the original 200 printed copies of the American Declaration of Independence, which was in perfect condition and worth over $2 million. Not bad for a $4 frame, I'm sure you can agree. Something of enormous value can sometimes look almost valueless. As we now turn to our reading from 2 Corinthians 4, we shall see an instance that Paul describes where there is a treasure that's hidden in something that looks almost valueless. Now let's read 2 Corinthians 4 verses 1 to 18. It says this: Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God. On the contrary, by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we preach is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. It is written, "I believe, therefore I have spoken." Since we have the same spirit of faith, we also believe and therefore speak, because we know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus from the dead will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you to himself. All this is for your benefit, so that the grace that is reaching more and more people may cause thanksgiving to overflow to the glory of God. Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. From this passage, where Paul is essentially defending himself and justifying himself, we get a fascinating insight into what he believed it meant to be a follower of Jesus. He certainly didn't think it was about being some form of charismatic genius personality whose silver tongue would instantly win him the respect and praise of anyone who heard him. He certainly didn't think it was about decorating himself in the finery and grandeur of those in power and authority at the time. No. Paul likens his role as a witness to Jesus as being a clay jar in which treasure is hidden. Obviously, a clay jar is the opposite of grandeur. A clay jar is the absolute basic container. It's easily broken, easily disposed of, and easily replaced. Paul presents himself as lesser because he wants absolutely no confusion that the good news, that he might be the good news he's sharing. He doesn't want to be confused of Jesus. He doesn't want anyone to be mistaken, anyone to mistake him for Jesus, and he doesn't want people to judge him for his failings, his struggles, and his vulnerabilities, as though they in some way spoke of the value of the message he had to share. He highlights his vulnerability in order to do this. Vulnerability is something we all experience and we all become acutely aware of from time to time or in different seasons of life. I think we all probably felt at least slightly vulnerable this week. Hearing the news on Tuesday that restrictions will be tightening and that we should be preparing to dig in for the long haul might have felt for some of us an awful lot like having the rug being taken from underneath our feet, leaving us feeling vulnerable, powerless, and exposed. Moments like this last week remind us all too clearly that we are vulnerable. When a virus runs out of control, the impact it can have on our everyday lives can be immense. Rightly, our vulnerability can leave us feeling frustrated, confused, and anxious. It's fair to say that this pandemic has done far more than anything else since the Second World War to remind us all of how vulnerable and fragile our lives are. Our fragility and vulnerability is something which I think naturally we spend a lot of our time running away from, denying, avoiding, hiding, or trying to fix. I think as Christians, it can be quite easy to think that being a Christian should shield us from our vulnerability. That having a relationship with God should give us some form of free pass out of struggles. When times are good and things are going more or less to plan, I think it's quite easy to fall into this way of thinking. Our praise to God for his blessings, that our circumstances are stable and that our life is comfortable, can lull us into a false sense of security that life will always be comfortable, life will always be stable, and we will always feel safe. Which I think is one of the reasons why we can feel so shaken when crisis hits. Paul views his status as a Christian a little bit differently to this. He doesn't see his status as a Christian as a free pass which protects him from struggles. In fact, he seems to think it would be a problem if it did. If being a Christian was a magic formula to an easy life, then Christians might be seen as some form of supermen or superwomen who stand above everyone else. And if this was the case, people might look to Christians for salvation rather than look to Christ. Rather, Paul doubles down on the importance of vulnerability, comparing himself to a clay jar, recognizing that he isn't called to answer the problems, but called to be the answer to people's problems, but he's called to share the hope of the gospel. Because the hope of the gospel is the treasure that sets Christians apart from the rest of the world. As Christians, like Paul, we need to accept that we are vulnerable and fragile. But unlike the world, this shouldn't cause us to despair. Because as Christians, we can celebrate that our hope isn't vulnerable. It isn't fragile. Our hope is certain, and it cannot be shaken or changed by the ever-shifting circumstances of this life. As Christians, we have a hope that tells us that this life isn't all that there is. As Christians, we have a hope that tells us that all the struggles and difficulties of this life will one day be wiped away, along with all the sickness, pain, and death. As Christians, we have a hope that assures us that when Jesus won victory over death, he guarantees our victory over death. As Christians, we believe that life is eternal. We believe that pain and suffering are temporary. And we believe that one day all things will be made new and all wrongs will be put right. Yes, this life will inevitably bring pain and struggles and difficulty and tears for us all. This is a universal human experience that we can guarantee. But we know there is hope. And that hope can sustain us. In our passage, Paul describes the hope of the gospel and the eternity it promises. For Paul, this meant that when he was hard pressed, he was not crushed. And although he was perplexed, he did not despair. And although he was persecuted, he was not abandoned. And although he was struck down, he was not destroyed. The hope of the gospel was an enormous source of strength for Paul because it offered an unshakable guarantee and it put everything in this life into its right context. We have that same hope. And it's a hope that we have to share. We live in a world that can become so easily overwhelmed with fear, overwhelmed with pain inflicted by a seemingly random and indifferent universe, overwhelmed by loss as we're constantly reminded that human life is fleeting and fragile. But the hope of the gospel overcomes all of that. The hope of the gospel says that we need not fear. The hope of the gospel assures us that we're not abandoned to the chaos and pain of a broken universe. Rather, we have been rescued by a God that loves us so much that he paid the highest price to restore us and to save us. The hope of the gospel tells us that this life is not all that there is. This life is but the beginning of an eternity with God, where there'll be no more crying, no more pain, no more mourning, and no more death. An eternity which is guaranteed for us by the victory of Christ on that cross. So with all this in mind, how should we react to a week like this, where our vulnerabilities have been exposed? I think it'd be quite easy to quite glibly say something like, with all the good news that we have in the gospel, surely we shouldn't be bothered about the bad news we hear day by day. That might sound very faithful and very Christian, but I think if we said that, we would have misunderstood the gospel. If we say the hope of the gospel means that we should simply shrug off a week like this, then I think we've misunderstood it. Because as Christians, as ones who hold on to the hope of the gospel, we aren't meant to become some detached, distant, disinterested people who are unaffected and unmoved by what happens in the world around us because we're too focused on the world to come. That is not what we as Christians are called to be. In his ministry on earth, Jesus almost definitely had a far better picture of eternity than anyone else. But that didn't stop him looking around him, meeting people where they're at, meeting the immediate need he saw in front of him. He built relationships with people. He comforted them in their need, and he wept with them as they wept. Jesus knew the beauty of the life to come, but it didn't blind him to the difficulties of the life that he lived. It's absolutely right for us to live the life we have in front of us in a real way. It's absolutely right for us to feel the loss and struggle in the life in front of us when it confronts us. We aren't failing as Christians when a global pandemic causes us to be anxious about the future or causes us to mourn the people or the plans that have been lost. We shouldn't try and convince ourselves that we're absolutely fine if we're not. We shouldn't just put on a brave face and pretend that everything is perfect and rosy when it isn't. Believe me, you won't fool yourself and you won't fool anyone else if you do. But as Christians, even in the midst of these circumstances, we shouldn't despair. Because as Christians, we have the unshakable hope of the gospel. And there is nothing that a pandemic can do to touch that. As Christians, we have absolute confidence in God's goodness and God's love for us, even in the midst of circumstances like this. As Christians, we have a cause for hope. A hope that says we've not been abandoned in our struggle, but we've been rescued. A hope that shows the depths of God's love for us. A hope that promises that while human life might feel fragile as a clay jar, we will one day live in a world where there will be no more crying, no more fear, no more pain, no more death, because the old order of things will have passed away and we will be with God. This is the hope that we have, and this is the hope that we have to share.